A number of years ago, me and my wife Saz, we were at a wedding of some friends of ours, and they're not Christians, they're not believers, but they decided to have a traditional church wedding. And we were there with a whole bunch of friends and family that we love and we care about and we've shared our faith with, we've invited to church, and a couple of them actually become Christians, and that's amazing, but the vast majority of them haven't taken that step yet. And even though we knew that it was going to be a different kind of service to the one we would have in Freedom, we were praying and saying, God, could you use it? Would you speak? Would you move? And it was a beautiful moment seeing our friends get married in this amazing church. But honestly, as we went through this service, I found myself getting really frustrated. And it's not that I've got a problem with people worshiping God in more traditional ways, and it's not that I don't think he could have moved, but as we went through this service with all of the rituals and the different things, it just was so out of touch and so irrelevant to these people that I cared about. And I thought, man, this is an opportunity that we've got to share the gospel with them in a way that matters, in a way that's going to make them think or question. And instead, as I looked around, I saw people nodding off and ignoring things and getting lost in the boredom of the moment, honestly. And as I got more and more frustrated, I needed to distract myself, so I started to look out of these beautiful stained glass windows. And as I was there, I thought to myself, God, this must frustrate you. And when we see Jesus in the Bible talking to people getting stuck in religious traditions or thinking, his response is strong. But instead of kind of getting in on my frustration, God asked me a question in this moment as I stared out of this window that I'll never forget. And he said, Dave, what's going to be your stained glass window then? It literally stopped me in my tracks. There in this moment, God was challenging me and saying, you're just as vulnerable about getting stuck in an area of thinking something so precious that you want to hold on to it the way you do church, and it could cost the generations you're trying to reach. At the time, Freedom, we were just getting momentum. We were starting to film things, starting to stream online, new music, super modern. We were cool, it was different. And yet in this moment, God wasn't going to agree with my frustration. He was going to provoke me to think about where I was at. As we look across the last 2,000 years of church history, we see these amazing moments of where men and women get revelations and encounters with God, and they lead to revivals. And what's fascinating is often they're connected to technological revolutions. Even think about stained glass windows, an amazing advancement in technology at the time. And why did churches end up having all these stained glass windows? It was because the majority of the people then were illiterate. And so the church took images and pictures in order to preach the gospel. It was a relevant to its time way of connecting anyone anywhere to a life-changing relationship with Jesus. But if we look across church history and we see these revivals and these moments, and you go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, often they've petered out. And I think it's because so often we take these revelations that lead to revivals and these revolutionary ways of doing church, and then we repeat them until they become relics. And this isn't about any particular denomination. The reality is God was saying that to me, for me and our church, because so often we get stuck as Christians. We get stuck in our preferences and our presumptions. If I had 100 people that regularly go to church and I ask them, why are you part of the church you're a part of? I can almost guarantee you I'll get a preference-based answer. Oh, I really love the music, or I love the way the preacher speaks, or I love meeting God in a building like ours. But the problem is that when we build church based on our preferences, it's one of the surefire ways that we're going to become irrelevant at some time, because there'll be something that's precious to us that we're not willing to let go of. Or maybe we build churches based around our presumptions, well, God's moved like that before, he's going to move like that again. And yet we've already heard in the changing DNA and the warrior poet DNA that we worship a God that's constantly on the move. He's the author and the creator of all innovation and creativity. And yet, as the church, we pat ourselves on the back for doing the same thing year in, year out, decade in, decade out, century in, century out. And yet we're missing and losing people as we do it. You see, I believe living relevant to our time is about exchanging our preferences and our presumptions for purpose. The purpose of reaching people. You see, I'm not saying that our preferences are wrong, but if they get in the way of reaching people, then we've got to become willing to lay them down. In fact, not just willing, maybe even passionately, regularly, aggressively laying them down. Because what really matters the most is not that I get to worship God the way I like or the way I have a preference or presumption. It's actually reaching my family and friends with the hope of the gospel of Jesus. You know, in the New Testament, there is this amazing revolutionary called Paul, and he writes most of the New Testament, these letters to the churches. And, you know, Paul grew up in an incredibly religious environment. Talk about preferences, talk about presumptions. This guy had a list longer than anybody. But when Jesus took a hold of his life, when the gospel took a hold of his life, all of that went out the window. He even says in one of his letters, what I used to count as gain, I now count as loss. In other words, my preferences, my presumptions, they don't matter anymore. All that matters is knowing Jesus and making him known. Even Paul, in the early years of the church, had to write to some of the early church leaders and challenge them about where they were falling into rituals and historic traditional things and somehow choking out the truth of the gospel. I love these words of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that give us such a picture of what it is to live relevant to our time, to exchange our preferences, our presumptions for purpose. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law to win them. To those not having the law, I became like them to win them. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people by all possible means so that I might save some. I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessing. You see, Paul is radically teaching us about what it means to be relevant to our time. He's laying down preferences, laying down presumptions, never once compromising on the truth of God, but reaching people, going beyond even what he was comfortable with, even what he'd known before. You know, Paul would have learned new skills, maybe even new languages, would have understood cultures, all for the purpose of reaching people, because that's what the gospel's all about. And yet so often for us, we're unwilling to lay down our preferences. In fact, so often when I talk to people who've maybe left churches, so often it's because something's changed that they don't like now. Rarely do I hear Christians saying, I love my church because it's a style that I don't like, but it's reaching people. Rarely do I hear people saying, man, I love my church. It makes me so uncomfortable. It pushes me out of my comfort zone just so I can reach my neighbors. Oh man, I love my church. As soon as you think you've got it sorted, it changes, and it's always changing. And actually, I don't really know what's going to happen next year, but it's all to reach the next generation. That's the kind of church I want to be. That's the kind of church I dream about being. I hope that in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, our church has got a reputation still because we're doing church differently, but reaching people. But living relevant to our time is not about having a few more lights on our set on a Sunday. It's not about having a few more cameras, not about just filming and streaming online. It's actually about what relevance really means, being present in the moment and reaching people. It's about laying down our preferences, adapting our methods for the times and the cultures we're called to reach. I'll never forget, a few years ago, I went to visit our campuses in India and was having lunch with Luke and Sophie, who were part of our team and leaders on the ground in the early years. As we sat in this restaurant, they ate with their hands, much like people would do in India, and they were incredible at it. As I sat there with my knife and fork, I said, guys, that's amazing. And they said, yeah, well, we're Indian now, aren't we? And in just one small way, they laid down their preferences, laid down their presumptions, even laid down their own culture for the sake of reaching people that they've been called to. And those, what seemed like small steps, were huge when it came to making a statement of what they believed about the people that they were reaching and the willingness that they had to do whatever it takes. And yet for many of us, we've got our preferences around our time, even our own homes. With Firestarter, some of us, maybe we feel God calling us to do it, but we don't really like the idea of the hassle of letting people in our homes, tidying up after them. Maybe even the investment of, in refreshments that's going to come out of our own pocket. And after all, we got to ask, am I letting my preference drive how I want to do church? You see, being relevant to our time, yes, is about how we lead our church, but ultimately it's about how you live tomorrow and the day after. You see, you're the most relevant message that God has in your community. Maybe you're a parent at school, reaching other parents at school. You're the most relevant person to do it. Somebody at university, at college, a business owner. You are the relevant message Jesus has, but how stuck are you in your preferences, your presumptions? Are you the kind of Christian that when you start talking about church, you just reel off these words that your non-Christian friends have got no idea what they mean? You see, the church has lost the art of translation. Relevance will never be compromised. In being relevant to our time, I'm not talking about twisting or adapting or changing the word of God just to fit in with current trends or thinking. That would be the worst thing we could do. Instead, I'm talking about learning how to speak the language of the world in order to preach the gospel in a way that they can grasp and understand, rather than doing it out of our presumptions and preferences. You see, some of us are going to be called into leading industries, but we're going to be called to walk the tightrope of relevance without compromise. Relevance of the truth of God in a world that's running further and further away from it. But this is the kind of church God's called us to be. He's called us to be on the front lines. He's called us to be on the edge of innovation, not catching up to it. I believe that the church that's relevant to its time will see a revival that won't peter out, but it will keep rolling and get bigger. I believe a church that's relevant to its time will be a church filled with young people, because we will appeal to the next generation, for they're the now and they're the future. I believe a church that's relevant to its time will be able to go into any culture, cross any border, any time zone, any people group. That's the kind of church that's relevant to its time. That's the kind of church I want to be. That's the kind of Christian I want to be. But what about you? What are the preferences that you need to lay down? What are the presumptions you need to let God come in and renovate and revolutionize? We are called to be relevant to our time. Every single one of us. It's essential to reaching our world. It's essential to connecting anyone, anywhere, to a life-changing relationship with Jesus.